This is the first of two courses about .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. This first course is Part 1, Exploration of the Core of .NET Core. And what I'm going to do in this course is to lay the foundation for a deeper look at ASP.NET Core. But my focus here is going to be on the underpinnings that .NET Core provides to ASP.NET. Now, if those terms don't make any sense, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain what ASP.NET Core is in relation to .NET Core and where they came from and where they fit into Microsoft's set of development tools. Then, in Part 2, we'll build on .NET Core in order to explore more deeply the new features in ASP.NET Core, which is what you want to use if you're developing web applications. Okay, now a couple things about the course. I am going to assume that you're familiar with classic ASP.NET and MVC, or the Model View Controller, way of developing web applications, as well as C#. Now, if you're not familiar with those, but you've done web development using other technologies, you'll probably be able to follow along and understand a lot of what happens. But I'm really going to assume, I'm not going to go back and explain fundamental ASP.NET and C# concepts, except as they relate to how they're different within .NET Core going forward. Now, one caution that I want to give you is beware of outdated core information. I'll talk more about this shortly, but Microsoft has been very transparent in its development of these core technologies. And they pivoted and rebooted the reboot a couple times. And so you're likely to come across a lot of information on blog posts, on MSDN, and various places, old magazine articles and so forth, that no longer apply to what was actually released. It was talking about earlier versions. Often, as Microsoft releases new products, that's not really a big problem, but it is with the .NET Core and derivative technologies. And one big sign is that if you see a reference to something called ASP.NET 5, that was the first name that Microsoft was calling what is now ASP.NET Core. And so if you come across a blog post or an article that references ASP.NET 5, other than to maybe say the technology formerly known as ASP.NET 5, that article probably is not going to apply to what was actually released. Okay, so just be aware of that caveat as you're looking at other information. Going forward, the technology is called .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, and that, of course, is what I'll be calling it in this course. Now, before we get started, I do want to briefly mention the tools that I'm going to be using in the course. Now, the main thing I'm going to be using is the .NET Core version 1.01 of the SDK. So this is the .NET Core SDK on which everything else is built. Now, there may be a later version available when you're viewing this course, but all of the principles that I talk about here should apply because these are actually the released bits, and Microsoft is big into not breaking backward compatibility. They certainly are breaking with the full .NET framework with .NET Core, but as .NET Core goes forward as a new product, they're going to try to do their best to maintain backward compatibility, with one exception that I'll talk about during the course. Okay, so you have to have the SDK. Everything is built on that. By the way, if you install Visual Studio 2015, you'll get this automatically and it'll update it for you. But if you're not, if you're using your own text editor, then you can download .NET Core separately, and I'll be talking about how to do that. Now in this course, I'm going to be using a tool called Visual Studio Code. Now I'm just going to be using VS Code here as a glorified text editor. But if you haven't checked out this cross-platform tool from Microsoft, it's definitely a nice code editor. They did a really good job. It's a step up from a plain text editor without all the bloated overhead, albeit the useful bloated overhead of Visual Studio. But so it's really a text editor on steroids. So it's a nice tool, but one of many tools that you can use. And as .NET Core is adopted on different platforms, there's other text editors that are getting features that work specifically with .NET Core. So you're not stuck with Visual Studio, you're not stuck with Visual Studio Code if you don't want to use it, you're not even stuck with Notepad if you don't want to use Notepad. Use the tools that work best for you. Okay, and then I also will be looking at the .NET Core tooling that's coming as part of Visual Studio. Now in this course, I'm using Visual Studio 2015 with all the latest updates, but future versions of Visual Studio will have the same kind of support for .NET and ASP.NET Core projects. But this is the latest version of Visual Studio as I'm doing this course. All right, so let's start talking about this reboot of .NET. So Microsoft began working on this reboot about 3 years ago. At that point, well really at this point, the full .NET framework is more than 15 years old and is definitely showing its age. It was created in a, let's just say, a less enlightened era of development, if I can be so bold. Security wasn't as significant. The web technologies have changed remarkably in that time. And over the years, Microsoft has added features. For example, they added MVC support to ASP.NET several years ago because that was turning into more of an appropriate development technology for many kinds of web applications, and was certainly driven by Ruby on Rails, or at least Rails initially, as well as other technologies. Okay, so Microsoft has added to it. It's this very large framework. It does a lot of things. It supports a lot of different application types. But it was born and grew up and matured in a different era of development. So it really has started to get to the point where they were having problems updating it for modern technologies. And it's a rather large monolithic blob of code. Okay, so it was really time for a do-over. Going back in history, that's probably about as long as Microsoft has stuck with a development technology. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but that's probably the case. Okay, so Microsoft started this reboot process, again, about 3 years ago or so, and is developing something that looks a lot like .NET. Certainly adopts a lot of its better architectural principles, but is making a break with the past. And so we can move forward to new application types and deal with the new realities of application development, including security of applications. And so they started this process, and to their credit, they used a very transparent process. So along the way, we saw the good and the ugly of the process. So they were constantly releasing. Most of it's open source. In fact, virtually all of it's open source. It's all up on GitHub. You can go there and take a look at all the pieces, download them, and do even put in pull requests and so forth. And they were blogging about it, and this is kind of what I referenced. A lot of the older blog posts from when they were starting out in the process, those no longer apply to the technology at all because they made such radical changes when they pivoted and changed. In fact, there were 3 major revisions, breaking most of what came before. And there's some bloggers that were kind of going nuts by that because a lot of us, what we were doing was developing small applications and updating them along the way as there was a new major release, and too many times just had to throw out the old code and start over because even names of things got changed. And so they were very transparent, but it was kind of an ugly process. But it was a very complex thing that they had to do. And to Microsoft's credit, when they saw that something was not going to work the way they expected to, they weren't afraid to throw it out. It slowed things down. We were all chomping at the bit to get the actual release version so we could start doing real applications with it. But they said, no, we're going to do it right. We're going to do it as right as we possibly can. So finally, .NET Core and ASP.NET Core is now released and stable. And in fact, we've even started to get minor revisions. But the thing is that what we have now and for the immediate foreseeable future is really just the beginnings of what .NET Core is going to be. So more is coming. And Microsoft has some roadmaps and have laid out their plans for adding the different technologies. So as you're going to see, that's going to be a major issue with whether or not you decide to go with .NET Core today. It's a released development technology, but it doesn't have all of the features that you might expect from the full .NET framework. And in fact, it may never get all those features. And I'll be talking about that. But so you have to be aware of what you're getting into. It's definitely the future for a lot of reasons that I'll be covering. But whether or not it's time to go to it now depends on your particular circumstances. Okay, so overall what this means is that the road to this core stuff has really not been a pretty one, with lots of twists and turns and do-overs, quite frankly. But the process was ugly only because Microsoft was so completely transparent about it. And it had to have been hard for them to be on the verge of a release, I think that was early in 2016, and then pull the plug on it because it just wasn't coming out right. So I think the process, painful as it was to watch, really is a testament to the new Microsoft. And I'm really happy for that change. And no, it's not because I enjoy watching people suffer. It's just because it's good to know what's coming. It's good to be able to play with the bits. It's great that it's open source, so you can actually download and modify it, and a very liberal license and so forth. So it's really a nice environment, far better in fact than the .NET framework is, as much as Microsoft has improved that over the years. Now, one huge downside to the transparency, though, is that Microsoft and others produced a massive amount of material about pre-alpha versions of what became .NET Core. In fact, one sort of annoying thing is that they often called new versions they released a beta version when it really wasn't, because the feature set wasn't nailed down. So I think Microsoft also learned a lot about what to call things. And through those three major overhauls, a lot of what was planned for .NET Core before it stabilized was dropped or got a massive overhaul. So be very careful, as I said, reading anything about .NET Core before about the spring of 2016, because that's when things really started to stabilize. Now, some older stuff will apply a little bit, but it's more likely that it'll send you down some really crazy rabbit holes. So just be aware of that. And thankfully, Microsoft promises that the changes to come aren't going to be as dramatic as some of those shifts that they made during the initial process. They're going to add features rather than radically change stuff, which is what they were doing during those pivots and pre-alpha releases, what turned out to be pre-alpha releases. So what Microsoft is heading towards is a common .NET, and I'll be explaining what that is. But the goal is to build a unified .NET base library with features that .NET code on all platforms can use. So this has a lot of implications that I'll be talking about at various times during the course. But they want to have a single core code base that essentially replaces the full .NET framework that we have today and runs on all devices from small to large, as well as all platforms. And that includes non-Windows platforms. Okay, so today there are several .NET implementations, each with its own features. And that includes both the full .NET framework as well as Xamarin. And Xamarin was purchased in early 2016 by Microsoft, or I guess maybe it was the summer of 2016. And so that is going to be essentially the .NET Core part for mobile devices, as well as for other operating systems. But the problem is that it's very hard to build libraries that run on any of the implementations because it's fairly fractured right now. And so Microsoft is creating a new .NET standard that is going to have the core functionality that is available and runs on any device on any platform where you deploy it. So essentially, that .NET standard is going to be a common base layer that all platforms should, or maybe even must, support. Okay, so where we are is that .NET Core is an implementation of .NET Standard that can run on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, various flavors of Linux, as well as iOS and Android through Xamarin, and more may come. Now, .NET is a general-purpose development platform that you can use for any kind of app where general-purpose solutions are needed. It definitely shares that similarity with the full .NET framework. And as Microsoft said in some of its marketing materials, it combines high performance and richness with a unique, differentiated developer productivity. Okay, now, I have to say that this is far from Microsoft's first attempt at building a development framework that crosses platforms, from the smallest mobile devices to the heftiest server, from Windows to Mac OS to Linux and beyond. And there are a lot of challenges dealing with the least common denominator for all platforms and then building native abilities from there. Because there's pretty much nothing worse than having an application that was clearly not designed natively for a particular platform, whether it's Mac OS or Android or Linux or whatever. Now, besides .NET, I work on a number of WordPress sites and various other things as well. But those WordPress sites mostly are hosted on Linux servers at a couple of hosting companies. I'd love to be able to deploy .NET Core apps, particularly ASP.NET Core apps, to those same servers. I have an account. It's a shared account in one case, a dedicated VM in another, and I'd like to be able to deploy WordPress as well as .NET Core applications on that same server. But right now, particularly on the shared servers, installation on Linux requires root access, and something I don't have on those shared servers. So until the hosting company makes it available, I have to have separate hosting for .NET Core apps. But that's going to get better over time. So all that said, this time Microsoft has a decent chance at success of creating this vision of a common .NET that runs everywhere. Open source and software standards have progressed to the point where this just might be feasible. Everything seems to be converging to make it happen. Unfortunately, only proverbial time will tell, but they are putting a lot of resources behind making it work. And with Windows becoming increasingly irrelevant, arguably so anyway, this is going to be crucial to the company moving forward that they support development on various platforms, even platforms they don't control. And it just amazes me that I say that about Microsoft. Not all that long ago, that would have been just impossible to consider.